Hi everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes just to let everyone file in. We'll give it a few more moments. But yeah, welcome to the Global Water Tariff Survey webinar, and we'll just give it a few more minutes before we begin. While we're waiting for everyone to join, Tallulah, could you move to the next slide and I'll show the Wordly, the app. So for this webinar, for those of you that need it, we are using a AI translation app. So if you need translation from English into another language, please scan this QR code and you will be given a drop-down menu of languages. Choose your language and you can have either audio or a transcription during the webinar. So please do scan the QR code if you need translation. Okay, so I think we will get started. So welcome to the Global Water Tariff Survey webinar. This is an exclusive webinar for members of LUO and the 300 Water Leaders, which are the two initiatives of the Global Water Leaders Group. So as I mentioned, if you need translation, then please scan the QR code. There's a range of languages you can choose from. This QR code will also appear throughout people's presentations, so hopefully you'll have a chance to scan again if you miss it this time. But please, those of you that need translation, scan now. Okay, so let's look at the agenda. So first, our utilities editor at GWI, Tallulah Lutkin, is going to present a global summary of this year's tariff survey, along with the main headlines and some key examples. Next, we're going to hear from Izan Azianti Samsuri, Senior Director in the Department of Licensing and Tariffs at SPAN, the national regulator in Malaysia. So look forward to hearing about how Malaysia's long-awaited tariff hike was achieved and how SPAN expect this to affect the water sector. Then we're going to hear from JC Davis, Director of Customer Care and Field Services at Las Vegas Valley Water District. So he was instrumental in introducing the excessive use charge, which has allowed the utility to stream ahead in meeting its targets. And then at the end, we're going to have time for Q&A. So throughout the webinar, please do post questions into the question function of the webinar, and we'll allow the questions to trickle in at all points. So please just do post whenever the question comes to you, and we'll answer them all at the end, as many as we can. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to invite Tallulah to get us started.
Hi everyone. So I am Tallulah Lutkin. I'm Utilities Editor at Global Water Intelligence, and I have been running and producing the tariff survey for a few years now. So I'm going to take you through the insights from this year and the few years previously as well, just to give you a good overview of the tariff survey. So before we begin, I'd like to give you, cover a few points of methodology about how we do the tariff survey, which hopefully will help you understand the data that I'll be presenting here today. So for the tariff survey, we collect tariff data for hundreds of cities worldwide. This year is our biggest ever. We have 616 cities in 190 countries. And for each city, we collect water, wastewater, and stormwater data. And all that is collected also separately in terms of the volumetric, fixed tariff, and VAT. So it's all broken down. You can see on that chart on the right the different components. And that enables us to have some really in-depth insights about the tariffs, not just the overall number, but all of those breakdowns as well. So we collect all of that data in the local currency of each country. So that is the price of water that people pay as presented by the utility, the municipality, or whichever authority publishes the water rate prices for the city that we have in the survey. So once we've collected that, to be able to compare the tariffs, we convert them all into US dollars at the exchange rate of the 1st of July of that year. And we also use a benchmark monthly consumption of 15 meters cubed because each city has a different way of structuring their tariffs. So that's why we need to standardize consumption as well. So unless I specify otherwise, any tariff that I present to you today will be in US dollars and will be the per meter cubed tariff for a monthly consumption of 15 meters cubed. So we use the data from the cities to show country and regional averages. So any country or regional averages that I present will be the average of the cities that we collect data from in that country or region. And the same goes for growth rates. So any country or regional growth rates are the average increase in tariffs for all the cities in that country or region from the year before. So it's going to be 2023 to 2024. And finally, unless otherwise specified, the increase that I'll be presenting are nominal increases, which means that they don't account for inflation. In the full survey that you can find on our website, we do have data and analysis on tariff increases when adjusted for inflation, and I will touch on that a little bit later. Okay, so now that's all clear, I'm going to move on to some of the stories and trends out of this year's tariff survey. So I'd like to start by talking about the headline figure of this year's tariff survey, which is the double-digit global average increase of 10.7%. Now, this is very high. It's certainly unprecedented since before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will say that that number is pushed past the 10% mark by some very high increases in Argentina and Turkey, and I will touch on that in a minute. But as you can see, if you look at the regional average increases here on this chart, there are some pretty high increases in most regions, not just Latin America and Middle East, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Africa. So all of these places have had pretty high record increases this year. So why are these tariffs so high? Quite a few reasons, but the main trend is that it's part of the post-pandemic pickup. So a lot of utilities froze or even decreased their tariffs during COVID. Obviously, there was a pandemic, people were losing their livelihoods. Water was, of course, a public health issue, and so tariff increases were quite difficult to justify at that time. In the following years, we started seeing already some pretty big increases, but a lot of those were a sort of knee-jerk reaction to the high inflation that we had in 2022 and 2023. As you remember, energy prices went up, inflation happened globally. So a lot of those tariff increases were operational increases. What is different and interesting about this year is that we're seeing inflation stabilizing, and we're still seeing higher increases than ever, which means that these increases are more forward-looking. They're intended to enable utilities to achieve cost recovery, to be financially secure, and ultimately to invest in infrastructure. So these increases this year are essentially CapEx-driven increases. And all this is squarely in the context of climate change, which is really pushing utilities to need to invest in resilience, be that financial resilience or infrastructural resilience, because at the end of the day, those two things go hand in hand. You can't invest in that resilient infrastructure if you don't have that financial stability. And there are a lot of examples this year of utilities increasing their tariffs directly to fund climate resilience, whether that's to flood or to droughts. So for droughts, we're seeing that in Brazil, we've seen it in LA, in Texas, and in the Middle East. And on the flooding side, we've seen Boston introduce a stormwater tariff this year. And so later on, we'll be hearing from the utility in Las Vegas, which is one of the driest cities in the United States, if not the world. And they've introduced some quite drastic measures to encourage water conservation through tariffs. So I'm going to delve into some little regional comparisons a little bit because I want to give you some of the stories behind those headline figures that you've just seen. So North America is the most expensive region at $5.42, followed closely by Western Europe at $4.70. And you can see on this chart that when we started collecting the tariffs for the tariff survey back in sort of 2011, Western Europe was actually more expensive than North America as an average tariff. But North America overtook Western Europe in about 2014 because North America in the last 15 years has done a really good job of delivering steady, roughly 5% average increases every year, and that was even during the pandemic. And there are some really good examples of American utilities implementing significant and regular tariff increases. For example, Central Arkansas Water, which got local authorities a couple of years ago to agree to a 10-year rate increase program that would double its tariffs over that time. So that's a really good example of consistent tariff increases to deliver resilience. But what is interesting about this year is that this year is the first time since the tariff survey began where Western Europe has a higher average increase than North America. So you can see Western Europe has a 6.2% increase and North America 5.5%. So Western Europe historically had sort of stagnating average increases around 1-2%. You can see that green line stagnating where North America's is going up. But since we've come out of the pandemic, Europe is really getting into gear, and we're seeing some big increases. You can see that line really pick up after 2022. This was initially linked to operational costs with that high inflation, but also now we're seeing the need to invest in compliance as new EU directives are coming in, and of course resilience to climate change. We've seen some really both heavy storms and drought events in Europe in the recent years. And that same trend is evident in Eastern Europe. So tariffs there overall are lower, as you can see that blue line, but they've been having some record average increases this year. It was higher than the global average. And in the last couple of years, we've really seen that. And that's also for those reasons of both compliance and resilience. Now, to stay on the topic of growth rates, I'd like to address the two elephants in the room, that's Latin America and the Middle East. So both have absolutely whopping growth rates this year, as you can see, 34.6% for Argentina and 20.8% for the Middle East. But the problem with averages is, unlike Europe and North America, where the average growth rate is a pretty good reflection of the growth rates by city, for Latin America and the Middle East, those big numbers are actually driven by just two countries, Argentina for Latin America and Turkey for the Middle East. So actually, if you remove these countries from the average increases, you can see that it looks very different. If you look at those dotted lines, that's the average increase if we remove Argentina and Turkey. And in fact, the increase is probably not that high compared to other regions. And I've done the same here for the global numbers, so removed Argentina and Turkey. You can see the average increase is still pretty high. It's still around 6%, which is really good, but it does fall below that 10% mark. So growth rates in Turkey have been particularly high for a number of years now, mostly due to the economic instability and high inflation that the country is experiencing. And this year we had a 265% increase in Diyarbakir in Turkey, so that's very, very high. But the most interesting story is actually Argentina this year, because although inflation has historically driven quite high rates there, this year the upheaval has been multiplied by new measures taken by the country's new president, Javier Milei, particularly the removal of subsidies, which has pushed operational costs up for utilities and therefore pushed up tariffs. And that has led to an over 900% increase in Buenos Aires. So that's really unprecedented for the tariff survey. We are actually doing a Latin America focused tariff webinar in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in delving more into that region in particular, just let us know and we can get you signed up for that. So in my last regional comparison, I'd like to address two regions that have really big disparities and where the headline average figure isn't necessarily representative of those disparities. So I thought I'd actually break out those regions into some more comparable sub-regions to give you a better picture of those regions and the data that we have. So first we have Latin America, where there's actually a massive difference between Caribbean nations, which actually have some of the highest tariffs in the world. So $8.90 for the US Virgin Islands, $8.52 for the Cayman Islands, $8.05 for Anguilla. These are in the top 5 most expensive countries for tariffs in the world. And that's because these island nations have very little fresh water, and so they rely on desalination for their water supply, which of course is very expensive. So actually those Caribbean nations are pushing the total Latin American average up. And if you take them out, for the rest of continental Latin America, average tariffs are actually more around $1.5. But I will say that Latin America does actually do a good job of increasing its tariffs year on year. So that's pretty encouraging in terms of tariff trends for that region. Now, there are some even bigger disparities in our East Asia Pacific region, which includes both Australia, which has tariffs sort of similar to Western Europe, and the Philippines, where tariffs are actually more similar to India and Southern Asia. So here I've broken out the sub-regional averages for high-income Asia. So that includes Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, with an average tariff around $2.82. The Pacific Islands with an average tariff of $2.40, where again we have some of those trends, a bit like in the Caribbean, where there are some high tariffs due to lack of fresh water. And then we have low income Asia, so that's that big dark blue block that you can see, where tariffs are actually pretty low. That's $39 per meter cubed on average, which puts those countries in line in terms of average tariff with South Asia, which is the region in our tariff survey with the lowest average tariffs. And at this point in time, that's probably not enough for cost recovery. And so we'll be hearing later on from our speaker from Malaysia, who's going to be talking a little bit more about the tariffs there. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's have another quick look at those regional averages. So I've broken out the sub-regions a little bit more now, so you can really compare those regions properly. And this time you can see that these averages are broken down between water, wastewater, and stormwater. Now, stormwater tariffs are really only a thing in some places in North America, in Europe, Oceania, and not all cities in those regions have them, and they are generally a small proportion of the overall tariff, as you can see, but they are the category of tariffs that is increasing the fastest. And every year we usually do have at least one city that introduces a new stormwater tariff. This year it was Boston in the US, and this increasing trend towards stormwater tariffs really demonstrates the need to invest in climate change. So, what better marker of investment in resilience to climate change than introducing a stormwater tariff? Another thing that you can see here is the disparity between the proportion of the overall tariff taken up by wastewater in regions where most cities have full coverage. So again, North America, Europe, high-income Asia have a much bigger proportion of wastewater in their overall tariff. And in fact, across the board, we are seeing wastewater tariffs going up more than water tariffs, because as we all know, wastewater and sanitation is expensive. So it can be expected that that part of wastewater is going to take up more and more of the total as time goes on. Now, as you're looking at the breakdown between water and wastewater tariffs, I'd also like to take this opportunity to talk about the difference between fixed and variable tariffs, because we're seeing some really interesting trends there. So now, although variable or volumetric tariffs, as you might know them, are a great tool to encourage conservation while having an affordable tariff for low users, variable tariffs can also mean a variable revenue stream. So that makes financial resilience a little bit more difficult. And in Salt Lake City this year, for example, the utility actually introduced a new fixed tariff, saying that it's because people were using less water and that was impacting their revenues. So, although there may be a global trend towards introducing more volumetric tariffs, we are seeing a little bit of a backlash against that in some places. And overall, the tariff survey data does show that fixed tariffs have a higher average growth rate than variable tariffs. So again, showing that utilities are looking to have more stable revenues that will enable them to invest in resilience. As a counterpoint to that, we will be hearing later on from our speaker from Las Vegas, who has managed to increase their revenues using an increased variable tariff. So again, stay tuned for that, because that's a really interesting story there. Now, the last point I would like to touch on is twofold, and it's demonstrated by this very simple line chart, which is probably my favorite chart about the tariff survey that I came up with a couple of years ago. So the yellow line here represents the number of cities in our survey where the tariff increase was higher than the inflation in that country. So basically that means that in those cities, tariffs increased in real terms. And the green line represents the number of cities where the tariff increases were lower than inflation in that country. So where tariffs actually decreased in real terms. Now you can see there's a pretty dramatic reversal in 2022 when we had that high inflation. And in that year, only 78 cities in the whole of the tariff survey out of 500 or 600 or so actually increase their tariffs in real terms. So we all know that inflation is a big problem because increased price of energy and building materials in the last few years in particular, those have really hit utilities hard. And so being able to increase tariffs above inflation is really important for financial resilience, but also really difficult, as we can see from this chart. But now I'd like to draw your attention to that blue line on the top. So that is the number of cities in the tariff survey that did not change their tariffs from the year before. So that's a 0% increase. And for me, that line is really the hidden picture of the tariff survey. It's utilities not increasing their tariffs at all. We talk a lot about the reasons why tariffs go up every year, and I've just spent 20 minutes discussing why they've gone up because of capital operational reasons. But in fact, every year, half of the cities don't increase their tariffs at all. They just stagnate. And this has led to a really interesting trend that we've been seeing in the last few years. And that's cities, regions, and sometimes whole countries where suddenly we're going to see really big increases. And when we go back and have a look and see when was the last time those tariffs were increased, it'll maybe be 5, 10 years ago. Sometimes it will be the first time that that city has increased its tariffs since we began the tariff survey. We saw an example of that last year in the Punjab region of Pakistan. There was some massive triple-digit increases, and in Lahore, for example, tariffs had increased since 2004. This year, we had quite a few African cities as well, increasing their tariffs quite sharply, and that was the first time since the pandemic. And of course, the biggest one this year is Malaysia. So tariffs have gone up across the country. And in some cities, they hadn't gone up for a really, really long time. In Kuantan, tariffs hadn't gone up since 1984. In Georgetown and Penang, tariffs hadn't gone up since 1993. That was the year I was born, so it's a while ago. And because those tariffs hadn't gone up for a long time, we were seeing some really, really big increases. So in Georgetown, for example, those tariffs went up by 127%. And we see that because these places haven't increased tariffs in a while, and so the increases tend to be pretty high because the cities have decades of inflation and underinvestment to catch up with. And so these high increases after a long period of stagnation are partially what have been driving these big regional and global averages that I've been talking about since the beginning. So this is really interesting to me because I think that we're really seeing this as a wider trend. More and more places that are realizing that these water tariffs absolutely need to increase, even if they haven't increased for a long, long time. And they need to increase that if FDG 6 is to be achieved and if we are to be more resilient to climate change. So I really hope that we're going to continue to see that blue line go down as time goes on. So I think this is a really good time to hand over to our next speaker from Malaysia, who's going to tell you a little bit more about those big increases that the country has been seeing after a long period of stagnation and the reasons behind it. Oh. Okay, so I've left the QR code for translation on there, but I think, yeah, Isana, I think we can move on to you if you'd like to begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this webinar. So today I want to take you on a journey of the recent water tariff hike in Malaysia. Can somebody share my slides, please? Okay. So today I want to take you on a journey of the recent tariff hike in Malaysia. So together we'll understand why this tariff adjustment is needed. It's not merely to resolve a financial issue, but a step towards ensuring that everyone has access to safe, reliable, and sustainable water. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, let me explain on water services structure in Malaysia. Generally, water services in Malaysia is regulated by Suruhanjaya Perkhidmatan Air Negara or National Water Services Commission, which SPAN is established under the Act 654, and this act grants power for SPAN to oversee and regulate water supply and sewage services and enforce water supply and sewage services laws and related matters. And we govern the industries via Water Services Industries Act, Act 655. So under this act, there is a clear boundary between water resources and water services, where water resources remain under the responsibility of state government, whereas federal government is responsible for policy matters in the development of a holistic water policy by setting policy directions. On this note, water services, which is from the point of water intake up until distribution to consumer premises, are governed under regulatory regime by Suruhanjaya Perkhidmatan Air Negara SPAN. Next slide, please. SPAN plays crucial role in regulatory and overseeing the water services industry. So as you can see from the slides, these are the main roles of SPAN, which of course the main responsibility of SPAN is for enforcing regulation under the Act 655. We also responsible to advise Minister and the Minister on matter related to water and sewage services, including the national policy and also on the tariff setting. The Commission issues license to water services providers, and we oversee the operations. We conduct audits to ensure compliance to the laws. Apart from that, SPAN also responsible to monitor on the monitoring and management of non-revenue water of the water operators. We also ensure clean and safe water supply to consumer and on the continuous basis. And SPAN also monitor the water quality standards. And we also exercise our power under the Act as described under the Act and also regulation. Next slide. This is the map of Malaysia. So generally, SPAN regulate water services area, the whole Malaysia except for Sabah and Sarawak. Sabah and Sarawak is still regulated under their own enactment, whereas Peninsula of Malaysia and also Federal Territories of Putrajaya and Labuan is regulated by SPAN under the Water Services Industries Act, Act 655. Next slide, please. These are entities regulated by SPAN, which among others are private water operators and also public sewage operators. We regulate them through issuing of class license, whereas the individual license is issued to public water operators and also private sewage operators. Basically, for water supply services, there are public operators in each state, which is responsible in provision of water supply in every state, whereas for plumbers, water supply contractors, sewage contractors, we also regulate them via issuing of permit. And permit is issued by scope of works under the Act 655. Next slide. These are the key challenges faced by water operators in Malaysia. As you can see, number one, the main issue is unsustainable water tariff, where the revenue is insufficient to cover the cost for the operation, and this has resulted in the deficit financial position of the water operators. So when the water operators face insufficient revenue, there are several impacts that can occur. Among others, this will reduce the service ability, and this insufficient fund lead to delays in maintenance and repair, and also the infrastructure deteriorating, lead to aging infrastructure. And as we can see, the NRW level, the non-revenue water level in Malaysia also is high, is at 34.6%, and the main factor is the leakage of asbestos cement pipe, which is, we have like about 40,000 kilometers of aging pipe which has not been replaced due to insufficient revenue. Apart from that, due to low water tariff, the high per capita water use is about 228 liters per capita per day is recorded in 2023. This is very high as compared to the water WHO recommendation, which stood at about 150 to 165 liters per capita per day. And due to insufficient water tariff also, water operators, they are unable to carry out their plan to upgrade the infrastructure, to build new water treatment plant, or even the upgrading, which this cause the reserve margin is low, which SPAN set a KPI of at 10 to 15%, but among 12 states, 5 water operators, the reserve margin is below 15%. Another challenges in the pollution of water sources. Pollution from industrial, agricultural, and urban sources affects water quality, and this is requiring additional treatment. And we have very aging water treatment plant. They are unable to treat the water supply. They are unable to treat the water source and the water. And we have faced many incidents of water treatment plant closure due to river pollution. Next slide. In view of this, to ensure water operators in Malaysia achieve full cost recovery, we have undergone water reform model, which is called asset-light model. Under the asset-light model, Pengurusan Asset Air Berhad was established, and Pengurusan Asset Air Berhad, who is a subsidiary of Ministry of Finance Incorporated, established with the objective of being the financier and implementer for the development works of water infrastructure in the nation. So with this, water operator, they have to transfer assets and liabilities to Pengurusan Asset Air Berhad PAAB, and in return, PAAB will provide financing for the capital expenditure for the water operator. So in return, water operator, they need to pay lease rental to PAAB. PAAB being a company incorporated under the MOF, Ministry of Finance, they are able to raise fund for the upgrading of water infrastructure works. Currently, PAAB, they have completed the restructuring amounted about 7.4 billion, and PAAB have implemented about 4.7 billion worth of project has been awarded to upgrade the infrastructure of water services industries in Malaysia. So in view of requirement to pay off the lease rentals, we can see the need of the tariff increase so that water operator can continuously provide continuous water supplies to the consumers. Next slide. As you can see from this slide, and as I mentioned, one of the most challenge faced by water industry in Malaysia is the low water tariff, which is unable to cover the operational expenditure and also capital expenditure. And this number is a number as of 2022, which average tariff is at RM1.43 as compared to the average total cost of RM1.75. So in view of this, 4 of the water companies face losses, whereas 4 just marginal profit margin, whereas another 4, they have recorded quite a stable of profit margin. So in view of this, and part of the journey towards establishment or towards journey of achieving the full cost recovery, tariff revision is required. So hence, Suruhanjaya Perkhidmatan Air Negara, together with the ministry, we have established tariff setting mechanism. Before this, tariff at 12 water operators, they have different tariff structure, and also the tariff rates are also different with different structure. So next slide, please. So under this tariff setting mechanism, we have established four main things, which is number one, we have standardized the tariff structure, because earlier each state, they have different tariff structure, and we under this tariff setting mechanism, we only have two main categories and three special categories. The main categories are domestic tariff, non-domestic tariff, whereas the three special categories are for the domestic supply, water supply, industrial and religious institution, and also shipping. Whereas under the tariff setting mechanism also, we have the determination of tariff cost component to be recovered by each category and band. So under this tariff setting mechanism, we have bands, which is block tariff. The higher the usage, the higher the tariff. And we also standardize the minimum charge under the tariff under the TSM, and this standardization of minimum charge is based on the 10 meter cube consumption threshold, whereas we have set under this tariff setting mechanism, the tariff must be reviewed every 3 years so that our water operator finally can achieve full cost recovery. And as you can see from these slides, the process of getting tariff review is started from the application from the water company submitted to SPAN review in accordance with the business plan, and we have to undergo public consultation. We need to engage public and also the politicians, and finally under the act it's a power of minister, but for Malaysia tariff we have to bring up to the cabinet level to get the approval, and this is a big challenge for Malaysia to get our tariff increase. That's why some of the states, the tariff has not been revised even up to 40 years, but recently we have managed to get the approval, which in 2022 August we managed to get tariff revision for the non-domestic category, and recent 2024 in February we managed to get a tariff increase for the domestic category. Next slide. So generally, the periodic tariff review is very important, very crucial to assist our water company to cover the capital expenditure and operational expenditure costs in achieving full cost recovery. As we are aware, like other commodities, the cost to treat raw water, sewage and sewage discharge is increasing. So hence the tariff revisions is required to cover the increase, the escalation in cost provisioning the water supply services. And again, there is a need for high infrastructure investment to develop, to upgrade a new and also existing water and sewage infrastructure. So as I mentioned just now, there are some states which have not revised their rates for more than 20 and 30 years. Finally, they get the tariff approved in 2022 and 2024 respectively. And of course, the impact, the failure of the operators to get the tariff increase, this will of course resulted in decline in the quality of their services. Hence, tariff review, regular tariff review is required. With the recent tariff, we managed to increase our tariff on average 13% for non-domestic category and about 10% for the domestic category. In terms of increasing in the revenue, water companies, they are able to improve their infrastructure. Next slide. It's the responsibility of SPAN also to ensure that the increase is not too significant, because we also responsible to protect the consumers. That's why as a regulator we have to ensure that the tariff increase is reasonable, and we cap actually the maximum of 30%, except for some states which have not revised more than 25 years, so we allow them to have an increase more than 30%. Apart from that, we also encourage the water company who have a stable financial position to give rebates to the needy, to the B40 category. So of course, our objective here to balance between the requirement of operator and also to protect the consumer as well. Next slide. So these are the journey for Malaysia to obtain our tariff revision. We have done various engagement with respective stakeholders, inclusive of we have done state engagement with 12 states governments and also the EXCO. Then we have also carried out public consultation with the NGOs and consumers and also the industry association. Apart from that, before we can manage to get the approval, of course, we need to also engage the parliamentarian. And finally, we also engage the reporters to get the buy-in so that our tariff increase is more smooth and we get support from all this group of people. Next slide. With the recent tariff increase, we estimated about 490 million additional revenue to all water operators in each total of 490 million of revenues, which of course, as we can see, these are the water companies providing services in each state. And of course, the revenue is differ from one state to another, depending on the requirement of operational expenditure and capital expenditure. And they have to pledge to upgrade the infrastructure and to improve their water supply services to the consumer. Okay, next slide. As a conclusion, financial sustainability is crucial to ensure that sustainability of Malaysia water services industry. And with the tariff setting mechanism, which is a transparent and fair tariff setting, coupled with tangible improvements in service delivery, will make future tariff hikes more palatable. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izan. That was really interesting. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, JC, to tell us about the excessive use charge in Las Vegas and how this helped the utility achieve its targets. Over to you, JC.
All right, depending upon where you are, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm JC Davis, the Director of Customer Care and Field Services for the Las Vegas Valley Water District. A quick word about us. We are a not-for-profit public water agency serving approximately 440,000 customers in the metropolitan Las Vegas area. Advance, please. We are reliant upon the Colorado River, drawn from Lake Mead. To those of you who've been observing these sort of things, we are in essentially year 25 of a drought, and our reservoir has gone from 95% full to about 1/3 full over that span. And so, go ahead, please. We have been asked, along with the other states, to pretty significantly reduce our water use. And we've taken a look, a comprehensive assessment of both where water gets used and how water gets used in the metropolitan area. So what I'm going to talk about today is a tariff. We really view it as a demand management tool to reach customers who have proven impervious to other forms of communication. So let's go ahead, please. So what we did is an analysis of our single-family residential use. And as you can see, the top decile of single-family residential customers use approximately the same volume of water per year as the bottom 6 deciles combined. And so you have to understand that for the last 25 years, really, since this drought began in earnest, we have been pleading and paying these customers to reduce their water usage and act as though they live in the driest metropolitan area in North America, which they do. And if you look at the change over time among the deciles, the bottom 3 deciles really didn't move much because, frankly, they didn't have that much to give. They're already using very little water. The middle deciles, 4 through 8, came down appreciably over the last 20 plus years just through voluntary measures. Deciles 9 and 10 were a bit more obstinate with particular attention to decile 10. Their usage actually managed to go up a bit over the last 20 years, even as all of the conservation messaging and water waste rules and all sorts of things, they viewed them as a nuisance and nothing more. So we needed to find a different approach to get their attention. Go ahead, please. So as you can see, this is an example of a top decile user. There's a whole bunch of reasons you can read on the left, but essentially they are living in a state of denial. They want to pretend that they live in rural Indiana or Illinois instead of the middle of the Mojave Desert. And again, we have been paying them, we've been pleading with them, we've done everything in our power to try to get this particular group on board in terms of water efficiency, because as you saw previously, they use an inordinate amount of water, and frankly, they just don't care. They have been completely resistant to all forms of communication, including very targeted communication to let them know just how much more water that they use than a typical homeowner. Their usage, we tried that program a few years ago, and their usage actually went up a little bit. And so I think they were trying to send us a message that don't tell us what to do. So we took a different approach. Go ahead, please. So what you're looking at here is the median use is in the blue, the average use, this is single family residential, is in the green above it. Obviously that average use is getting pulled up by something, and that something is your top decile of customers. What you see in the black is a seasonally based threshold for an excessive use charge. And this wasn't arbitrarily set. What I did is I took all single family residential use and I actually broke it into percentiles. And these values are set at rounding to the nearest 1,000 gallons, which is how we bill, the 90th percentile for that particular month. And so it's designed, the way I've described it to people is if a seasonal water rate and a super tier had a love child, this is what it would look like. Because essentially it says during the winter, when you almost don't have to irrigate at all, your usage should be a very modest 14,000 gallons. That, again, that's the 90th percentile of customer use. And as you can see, that's in the neighborhood of double what the median water use is. So that's a fairly generous allowance. In fact, you can get more than 250,000 gallons of water a year delivered to your home and never touch these thresholds if you just use water appropriately for the season. Go ahead, please. So this just gives you a sense here. So now we're talking about large lots. And so that we define large lots as between 1/2 acre and 1 acre. And I know if you're in England, that's a tiny lot, but we're a very urbanized, densely populated community. And so most lots are less than 1/4 acre. But we made allowances for larger lot sizes so that they weren't being unfairly penalized. And so if you look at the yellow gold line, that's the median 1/2 to 1 acre lot usage. And as you can see, for the most part, it stays at or below the excessive use charge thresholds. Then you have the high use, which I defined as the 8th decile 1/2 acre to 1 acre lot. And as you can see, during the winter, it stays kind of at or near the thresholds, and it rises a bit above it during the summer months. Then you have the 9th decile within the large lot community, as you can see in the red line, and it rises well above in all parts of the season. So these are just people like the photo I showed you a few slides ago that are just living in defiance, and they said, "Yep, we don't care where we live. We're going to do what we're going to do." And then this is an actual property, and it's not even the worst of them. I didn't put the worst of them in it because it basically ruined the chart. Everything else looked flat compared to the highest user, which is the Sultan of Brunei's brother-in-law's house that we don't think he's ever actually been in, but typically uses 20+ million gallons per year at that compound, even though we don't think he's ever actually stepped foot in the property. But this is just a sample from the ultra high user. And as you can see, they have utter disregard for the fact that they live in the middle of the desert. Go ahead, please. So we are a fully deployed AMI system, so we have very granular data on how our customers are using water. What you see with the red arrows pointing down, on Sundays, water use is for irrigation is prohibited by service rules, and they can be fined for that. Yes, some people do violate it, and we can actually see it, and we send them warning letters and that sort of thing. But it gives you a sense if you're not irrigating, even if you have a pool, and this particular property has a pool with an auto refill valve, how little of your water use is actually being consumed for domestic purposes. The vast majority of this usage is irrigation. And so, when people talk, well, we have 4 kids in the household, we've done a number of studies and continue to refine those. And typically, depending on the household size, the indoor domestic use is going to be between 4,000 and 5,000 gallons a month, often less for people who are empty nesters or that sort of thing. Go ahead, please. So what we're looking for when we look at the hourly data, you can find the irrigation spike, and obviously that you can see they actually have 2 separate bits of irrigation. We can go, the 5 a.m. is an irrigation, likely drip irrigation, or one cycle of grass irrigation. Then the 11 and the 8 p.m. Spikes are pretty equal. There are definitely spray irrigation, and then the 10 p.m. So as you can see, most of if you look at the very low bars, 5 p.m., 7 p.m., etc., that's kind of what they're doing inside their house. Most of their usage is irrigation. Now, to give you a sense, we've done a study, and a typical spray irrigation system is designed to deliver about 15 gallons of water a minute, or 900 gallons over a full hour. However, they should only be irrigating grass 12 minutes per day. And as you can see, they're watering grass the equivalent of more than 2 hours. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to get them to cut back on a bit. Go ahead, please. And this chart just gives you a sense of how it's a repeating pattern, right? So you look at Sunday, you don't see the big spikes. If you look at Monday and Tuesday, you see almost identical spikes. That's because the vast majority of people in Southern Nevada have a programmed irrigation clock. And so we can see exactly what they're doing. We know it's irrigation, and that's where we're trying to get them to be more modest in their use. Go ahead, please. So not all excessive use charges are the result of a mansion with a a rainforest and on it with a lot of grass. As you can see, the one on the left is a very modest house, almost no landscaping at all. They had a service line lake, and we actually have the ability after 72 hours to send them text messages, robocalls, and then eventually we'll send them a snail mail letter if they haven't responded, saying something is amiss on your property, you really should check it out. We've developed a whole suite of tools to help people diagnose leaks. We actually have a program that gives them a voucher to hire a leak detection company to come out and find it, because these are not the people we're looking for. These are just people that had something bad happen at their house, and we want to help them out. And I'll make the note at this point, because I'm going to bring it up later, that if in fact we can see that your excessive use was due to a leak rather than to a behavioral issue, we will reverse it all if you fix that leak in a timely manner. Go ahead, please. And again, this just shows leaks are pretty evident. They pop right off the screen on us. And so not only can we see when they're happening so we can alert customers, we see when they stop so we can tell that customer, and frequently do, hey, whatever it is you did, it worked and your leak is no longer. Go ahead, please. So most people get the message. If you look at the occurrence of excessive use charges, just in this subset of customers that receives it, which is about 6.5% of all single-family customers so far this year, about 60% have only gotten it once or twice. And the people, like in a couple of the images I've shown, that represents about 1/3 of 1% of all single-family customers who are getting the excessive use charge every single month. And so it's really targeted to those customers who are being obstinate about their water use. Go ahead, please. On a related note, as you can see on the pie chart on the right, about half of the customers who get the excessive use charge get what I refer to as a love tap. So it's 5 units or less. Each unit, each 1,000 gallons that you use beyond the threshold is an additional $9 for that 1,000 beyond your volumetric rates. And so by the time you get done, if you are using an inordinate amount of water, that last 1,000 gallons is costing you a total of $15 per 1,000 gallons. But as you can see, most people get the love tap. Only a relatively small percentage get a significant excessive use charge. In the first year of the policy, it generated a little over $31 million. But I think it's important to say here that this was not intended or designed as a revenue generation exercise. It was designed as a demand management exercise. So now we can go ahead, please. So when you look at that, it worked. Putting it, I imagine most of the people on this call work in megaliters, and that should be 11,000 and change megaliters that were saved just from this specific subset of this sector, right? So take single family residential, then just take the 6.5% of single family residential that we're subject to the excessive use charge. And if you look at their year-over-year reduction in use, it was 9,500 acre feet or 11,000 and change megaliters. So it had a pretty significant impact on our community's water supply. Go ahead, please. I would note here that we tested it on the far right. You can see before we ever engaged at the excessive use charge, we surveyed it. We wanted to find out, was this the measure that was going to bring out the torches and the pitchforks, or are our customers going to understand what we were trying to accomplish and be accepting of it? And they were very accepting of it. And then we implemented it, and right, you would expect that perhaps that tune would change a little bit and you get more resistance. it's actually stayed just as popular today, or as of June 2024, as it was before we implemented it. To date, in fact, because we do this with all of our conservation measures, this is the single most popular conservation measure that we've ever implemented. Go ahead, please. And so, as I said, this wasn't a revenue generation exercise, but it has allowed us to do some things. We segregate the funds from the excessive use charge. We have developed a new leak repair reimbursement program, whereas if you have a mainline leak at your house and it costs you $2,000 to fix it, you send us a receipt, we will actually send you a check for $1,000. So we'll pay up to 50% of the repair cost for you to address your leak. We also developed a program for low-income customers who just don't have the money to make those repairs that funds 100% of their leak repairs. And so what we're really trying to do is use the excessive use fund fees to fund other water efficiency projects and reduce our consumptive use as a community. Go ahead, please. And with that, I will take any questions. And if we don't have time in the Q&A, I'm happy to connect with anybody offline and we can chat at your leisure.
That's great. Thanks so much for those two really, really interesting presentations from JC and from Izan. If you're happy to stay on the line for a few more minutes, we have some questions that have started coming in. So we have one for JC. So are you happy with the charge as it stands, or do you envisage taking it further in the future? So I'm assuming making it more stringent or more expensive.
So I designed it so that you could look in any given year and see where the 90th percentile of single family usage fell, so that you can move it up and down as you need to. At this point, they haven't had a need. It's still being successful. In a perfect world, fewer and fewer people every year will be subject to the excessive use charge because they will change their behavior. And that's actually what we're seeing so far in 2024, is that the percentage is decreasing slightly. And I think it would be more pronounced even this year, but we had an extraordinarily hot summer that began at the beginning of June and really hasn't stopped. Like this last week is the first time that it hasn't been above 100 degrees Fahrenheit since May. So, but it's doing exactly what it was designed to do, but we built it with the flexibility to adjust if need be.
That's great. Yeah, so building that flexibility in seems to be really important. And actually, there's a sort of, I guess, slightly related question for Izan, if she's still on the line. Are saying that utilities in Malaysia previously had been frustrated when tariffs were supposed to be reviewed every 3 years, but actually wasn't enforced. So how are you going to ensure that the tariff will actually be reviewed every 3 years without fail?
I think, again, this is a process that we have to undertake because in accordance with Act 655, the power is just at the minister's level. But again, the decision has been made by the parliament, in which anything that will increase that will involve in increase in cost of living, so we need to bring up to the parliament. So that's why I think at officers level, we need to ensure the process being done, and we need to work together with the water company, SPAN, and also minister. And we, of course, the most important here is the political master. They must have a will. They must understand the situation faced by Malaysian water operator. Without the tariff, we are not going to achieve financial sustainability, and hence the services will deteriorate. So I suppose at working level, we need to ensure every 3 years the tariff must be revised to reflect the actual cost required by water companies.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
we all know how difficult sort of politically it is to increase tariffs. And I think that that's
Yes.
something that
Yeah.
I've definitely seen in the tariff survey.
It
You know,
will be
I
good
was
if we
talking
can
about Turkey.
depoliticize it.
Exactly, I completely agree. And
Yeah.
you know, I was talking about Turkey earlier, and we have, you know, always big increases in Turkey. And actually, last year there was a decrease in Turkey because some local politician promised to reduce tariffs, and they went straight back up this year again. So it's really another issue for sure.
Yeah.
I'd like to encourage anyone, if they have any questions, any attendees have any questions, to pop them in the webinar software in the questions function, just so we have our speakers online. It's really great to benefit from their knowledge. Okay, we have a question for JC. Have any other utilities, either from the US or elsewhere, been in touch to ask about your experience with the excessive use charge and about replicating it? And, you know, what have those conversations been like?
The short answer is yes. We've gotten calls from utilities around the United States and in other parts of the world as well. And I always encourage them to, before they just sort of leap into this, to really understand how water is being used in their community. Because if, for instance, it's a very vertical community, you have a lot of apartment condominiums, there may not be enough of an opportunity. In our case, there was such a glaring disparity between both the bottom deciles and the top decile, and even the median and the top decile. And when I looked at the usage trend over time, I found that it was just that one subset who were being completely resistant to any form of water efficiency. That it made sense in this circumstance, but it doesn't work for everyone everywhere. But as you saw in the slides, we sold 9,500 or about 3 billion gallons less water to that specific group of customers last year, and we made $31.5 million more money doing it. And so people are always, utilities and the ones I've talked to in the US, they're always afraid of doing anything that's going to curtail demand because they're worried about the revenue stream because of the sustainability. And I absolutely understand that. But it doesn't have to be that way if you structure it so.
That's a really interesting point. And I think that, you know, that's something that I've definitely come across, is this sort of paradox between encouraging conservation and also ensuring revenues, and how do you structure a tariff. So I think it's really great to have an example of having, you can have your cake and eat it in terms
you
of
really
consumption,
can,
conservation and revenue.
On sort of a related note to tariffs and going back and reviewing every 3 years, we in 2017, I believe it was, actually went through, and rather than going just for a straight tariff increase, we did a modest tariff increase that was tethered to inflation, CPI index for the Western United States, and had it enact in perpetuity. So unless the board of directors rescinds it every year based upon the CPI, as we refer to it, the rates will increase by that percentage, and it's bracketed, right? So you have a minimum and a maximum, and that allows us to stay on top of the infrastructure, because as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, infrastructure replacement is only getting more expensive, and it's never been more important.
No, that's fascinating. I think it's really good to have those examples of being able to implement tariff changes that are regular, and I think that's, you know, what you guys in Malaysia are trying to do. And I actually wanted to, I don't think we've had any other questions into the chat, so I'm just going to ask my own question. But Izan, how did you, you know, so JC showed us they've done these surveys about people being happy with the excessive use charge, but you know, in Malaysia, some of these places hadn't seen tariff increases, as you said, for 20, 30 years. So, you know, how did you and how did utilities communicate about these tariff increases, and what was the response from local populations?
Well, actually, when we had consultations with the public, in fact, on certain states, they are looking at improvement in services. So in fact, they ask us why delay in tariff increase. They can understand, because to them the level of service is more important rather than dollar and cents to pay the tariff. So they are willing to pay at a reasonable rate, but of course they require a quality of service. So from our consultation, we did receive a good feedback from public. I can say that the major obstacles here is more on political side rather than from the public, because public, they are willing to pay with a better quality of services.
That's a great answer.
And
Yeah,
from our engagement and consultations, and also we have done awareness, I think public generally they can accept, because the tariff is still currently in Malaysia is among the lowest. If we compare to Singapore, the rates is because the model is cost plus plus method as compared to Malaysia. Because Malaysia, if you use less than 20 cubic meter, very minimal. We only charge consumer just up to cover the operational expenditures. Unless if you use more than 35 cubic meter, then only the tariff will be higher. 47% of consumers in Malaysia use average of 20 cubic meter of water.
right. Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. Yeah, so it's all about the politicians.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we don't have any questions on the chat, so I'm just going to wrap it up. And we've gone over time as well, so it's time to let everyone go. But yeah, thanks so much to Izan, thanks so much to JC for being on the call. It's some really, really interesting presentations, and yeah, thanks to the audience. And if you have any other questions that come to you, just email us and we'll get those questions answered. Yeah. So thanks very much, everyone.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.